April 12, 1942. Noon burned down on the road to San Fernando, the Philippines, 10 days since the fall of Bataan. The sun turned the dirt road into fire beneath their bare feet, and the smell of sweat and death mixed so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Every step was agony. Private First Class Daniel "Danny" Reeves could still hear the gunfire from the peninsula behind them. The last stand of Bataan was over, and for the first time in his 22 years he had no rifle in his hands, no hope of retreat, no control over his fate. He stumbled forward in a column of thousands, Americans and Filipinos alike, their numbers once proud, now reduced to shadows. There were no rations, no canteens, no mercy. The march stretched over 60 miles of heat, and men collapsed where they stood, only to be struck down by bayonets or rifle butts. Reeves had counted at least 20 bodies that morning. He stopped counting when his vision began to blur from thirst. And then came the smell. At first he thought it was another hallucination, like the phantom glasses of water he kept imagining, or the roast chicken his mother had once placed in the center of their Ohio dinner table. A sweetness drifted on the wind, faint but undeniable, cutting through the stench of sweat and rot. He blinked. It smelled like oranges. The prisoners around him caught it too, heads lifted, eyes hollow but curious. The air was heavy with the scent of fruit, so out of place it felt like mockery. When they reached San Fernando, the truth revealed itself. Piled near the railway station where their hellish march ended under the watch of bayonets were crates. Wooden crates stacked high, stamped with Japanese characters. And inside them, bananas, oranges, pineapples, fresh fruit. The men froze. Their bodies begged for water, their stomachs gnawed with emptiness, but their minds couldn't reconcile the sight. After days of cruelty and death, the crates looked like treasures from another world. A Japanese officer barked an order. Prisoners were herded into rail cars, 80 men jammed into each, walls of iron that turned into ovens in the sun. Hours passed in suffocating dark. Reeves clung to consciousness, his lips cracked, his shirt soaked in other men's sweat. He thought he would die there. But at dusk, when the doors slid open, something unthinkable awaited. Guards handed down pieces of fruit. A banana pressed into his hand, yellow skin warm from the sun. Reeves stared at it, trembling. He had expected a rifle butt, not kindness. He peeled it slowly, hands shaking, and when the sweetness hit his tongue he nearly wept. Around him, hardened soldiers sobbed openly as they tasted something they thought they would never see again. It wasn't salvation. It didn't erase the bodies left on the road, the cruelty of the guards, or the hunger still gnawing. But for a brief, surreal moment, the sweetness of fruit was like life returning. The strangeness of it clung to him as they were marched again, this time to their camp at Cabanatuan. There, they expected only misery. But what they found, in fragments and contradictions, was stranger than any of them could imagine. The gates of Cabanatuan clanged shut behind them, and the sound was like a sentence passed. Reeves shuffled inside with the others, the banana peel still clutched in his hand, brown and curling. It had been the sweetest thing he had ever tasted, but the sweetness left faster than it arrived. The guards' rifles and the barbed wire erased any illusion that this camp would be a place of comfort. The camp spread wide across a stretch of low fields, ringed with watchtowers. Long barracks of rough wood leaned against each other like tired men. The smell was everywhere, latrines dug shallow, sweat baked into planks, the sour stench of men too sick to move. It was not a camp meant to hold soldiers with dignity. It was a camp meant to break them. The first days blurred into one another. Morning roll call beneath the rising sun. Beatings for men too slow to stand straight. Rice rations so thin that they felt like cruel jokes, a ball of sticky grains, barely enough to coat the stomach. At night, the moans of dysentery patients echoed through the dark like ghosts. Reeves lost track of days. He stopped counting meals because they weren't meals at all. And then came the fruit again. It was during the second week, after a work detail unloading crates from a truck. The men bent double in the heat, their ribs visible through tattered uniforms, carrying sacks of rice too heavy for their weakened bodies. Reeves felt his vision narrowing, the edges going black, when he heard a sound that froze him. A laugh. Not an American laugh, a Japanese one, high-pitched, quick. He turned and saw one of the guards peeling a tangerine. The skin curled off in bright orange spirals, its scent flooding the dusty air. The guard ate slowly, savoring it, watching the prisoners sweat. Reeves wanted to scream. But then, without a word, the guard tossed the peel aside and held up another tangerine. He tossed it underhand to the nearest prisoner. The camp went silent. The prisoner caught it, staring as if it were gold. Another guard barked something sharp in Japanese, but the first shrugged, pulled another fruit from the crate and handed it down. Within minutes, half a dozen Americans held oranges and tangerines in their hands, biting into them with tears running down their dirt-streaked faces. Reeves watched, stunned, as the juice dribbled down chins, sticky and bright, cutting through the monotony of rice. It wasn't charity, it wasn't kindness, it was something stranger, perhaps boredom, perhaps a guard's whim, but to the prisoners it felt like touching a life they had forgotten. Weeks turned into months. Work details, roll calls, punishments. Men grew thinner, their eyes hollowing, their uniforms reduced to rags. Some gave up and withered in their bunks, refusing to rise. Others clung to small rituals, folding scraps of paper into cards, singing songs quietly in the dark, writing names into the dirt so they would not be forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, the Japanese allowed them tastes of something that seemed impossible. A handful of fresh bananas, split among dozens of men, each taking a bite as if it were a sacrament. A plate of rice balls with sweet bean paste, passed around after days of punishment details. Once, on a night when even the guards seemed subdued, a tray appeared with what could only be described as dessert, a gelatinous mound, translucent and wobbling, flavored faintly with sugar. Reeves tasted it slowly, almost in disbelief. For a moment he was back in Ohio at the county fair, tasting penny candy. Then the darkness of the barracks closed around him again, and he was in Cabanatuan, sharing crumbs of sweetness with dying men. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. How could the same hands that beat men with rifle butts also hand out slices of pineapple? How could the same guards who forced prisoners to bury their friends in shallow graves watch them laugh for a moment over a shared dessert? It gnawed at Reeves at night. One evening, lying on his straw mat, he whispered to his bunkmate, Corporal James Larkin, "They're trying to break us, Jim, but why give us that fruit? Why give us anything?" Larkin coughed, his voice ragged. "Because it confuses us, because it keeps us guessing. Cruelty you can resist, but this makes you doubt." Reeves lay awake, staring at the roof beams. He knew Larkin was right. The fruit was not mercy. It was a weapon of another kind. Still, he couldn't deny what it did to him. Each time he tasted something sweet, each time juice touched his tongue, a part of him remembered that he was human, that life existed beyond the wire, that the war had not taken everything yet. And that was dangerous too, because hope could be a blade as sharp as despair. The camp shifted with the seasons. Rains came, flooding the grounds, turning the latrines into rivers. Malaria and dysentery took dozens. Then came the dry months, when dust choked throats and men collapsed from sunstroke. Through it all, the rhythm of camp life remained. Hunger, labor, punishment, rare moments of sweetness that felt almost cruel in their rarity. Reeves began to mark time not by days or weeks, but by fruit. The day of the first banana, the day of the tangerines, the day of the sweet bean paste. They became markers of survival, of endurance. Strange milestones in a world designed to erase all sense of life. He thought of home less and less, not because he had forgotten it, but because memory hurt too much. His mother's kitchen, his father's voice, his sister's laughter, they were all wrapped up in the taste of sweetness. And each time a piece of fruit crossed his lips, it was like opening a wound again. The contradiction of the camp deepened. Men whispered about guards who sometimes shared cigarettes, or about the occasional package of food sent by the Red Cross that somehow made it past the war's blockade. Others whispered about guards who killed without hesitation, who relished punishment. The truth was both, all at once. A world where brutality and small mercies lived side by side, twisting the mind until nothing made sense. Reeves kept going, one foot after another, one day after another, one strange, impossible bite of sweetness after another. And with that, the camp became not just a prison, but a mirror showing the Americans not only the cruelty of war, but its contradictions, its fragments of humanity in the unlikeliest places. A place where a man could be beaten half to death in the morning, and in the evening taste pineapple so sweet it made him believe, for just a second, that he might survive after all. The first sign that something was changing came not from the guards, but from the silence. For months, Cabanatuan had been filled with noise, boots striking the ground, shouts in Japanese, the coughs and groans of sick Americans. Then one morning the gates opened and a column of new prisoners stumbled inside. They were rail-thin, uniforms hanging like rags, eyes so hollow they seemed already halfway to death. Reeves had never seen men so wasted. They were from another camp, brought here after disease had swept through their old one. Some whispered they were survivors of Palawan, others from Davao, and a few even claimed they had been on transport ships that were bombed by American planes. Whatever the truth, their arrival changed the air. They carried news. Quietly, in broken whispers, they spoke of Japanese ships sinking under relentless air raids. They spoke of islands falling, of American landings creeping closer. They spoke of rumors that MacArthur was back in the Philippines, his promise not abandoned after all. Hope flared, fragile and dangerous. Reeves watched it spread like sparks in dry grass. Men who had long stopped talking about home began murmuring again. They spoke about liberation, about holding on just a little longer. Some even laughed for the first time in months. But laughter in Cabanatuan was always met with suspicion. The guards noticed it too. Their discipline grew harsher, their tempers shorter. And then, curiously, came more food. Not much, not enough to make anyone believe in miracles, but more. Rice balls wrapped in strips of seaweed. Small cuts of fish, cooked unevenly but real. Once even a sugary rice cake, pale and sticky, its sweetness so faint Reeves thought at first he had imagined it. But no, it was there. Sweetness, undeniable, melting on his tongue. The men whispered in their bunks at night. Why now? Why this sudden appearance of fruit, fish, and cakes? Some believed it was a trick to keep them alive just long enough for labor. Others thought it was pride, that the Japanese did not want Americans to die too quickly, not when they could be shown off as prisoners. But some, like Reeves, began to wonder if it was desperation. If Japan's grip was slipping, and even in the camps the cracks were beginning to show. He remembered one afternoon clearly. The sun was brutal overhead, baking the dust into a crust that clung to their throats. Reeves and the work detail had been ordered to dig drainage ditches, their bodies trembling with weakness. Suddenly, a guard barked an order, and another appeared carrying a basket. Inside were mangoes, their skins golden and soft. The guard set them down, and the men froze. For a moment nobody dared move. The fruit gleamed like jewels in the dust. Then one by one the mangoes were split and handed out. Reeves bit into his share and felt the juice run down his chin, sticky and rich. He closed his eyes, and for a second he wasn't in a prison camp. He was 12 again, running barefoot in summer, biting into peaches from his aunt's orchard in Ohio. When he opened his eyes, he saw other men with tears on their faces. They weren't just eating fruit. They were tasting freedom, if only for a moment. But sweetness was always followed by bitterness. The very next day, 3 men were beaten for failing to carry timber fast enough. One never stood again. Another was dragged off, his fate unknown. The message was clear. Whatever mercies were given, the camp was still a place of death. Reeves began to realize that the fruit, the desserts, the small kindnesses, they weren't separate from the cruelty. They were part of it. The sweetness disarmed you, made you believe in survival, only to be crushed again when punishment returned. It was a cycle designed to twist the soul. Yet paradoxically, it gave him strength. Reeves began to mark time not just by fruit, but by rumors. Mango Day came with whispers that American forces were in Leyte. Pineapple Day arrived with word of Japanese supply lines being cut. A rice cake appeared around the same time men whispered that Manila might soon fall. The guards never spoke of the war, but their faces betrayed them. Some looked harder, angrier, their shouts sharper, their fists quicker. Others seemed subdued, staring off toward the horizon, as if calculating whether Japan could really withstand the weight pressing against it. Reeves saw the shift, and he knew the guards saw it in him too, that flicker of hope he could not quite hide. Hope was dangerous, but it was also survival. One night, as the camp settled into uneasy silence, Reeves shared his thoughts with Corporal Larkin again. "They wouldn't feed us like this if they thought they were winning," Reeves whispered. "They wouldn't waste the sugar, the fruit, not on us." Larkin lay back on his mat, staring at the dark rafters. "Or maybe they're keeping us alive. Maybe they want witnesses when the war ends, proof that they treated us human." Reeves frowned. "Human? You call this human?" Larkin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The contradiction hung in the air. Days blurred, work, roll call, punishments, and then again sweetness. A guard passing around dried persimmons, their surfaces powdered with sugar crystals that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The men devoured them, each bite sticky and chewy, each swallow a reminder of life beyond wire and rifle. And with each taste, Reeves felt his resolve harden. He would not die here. He could not. Not while the war outside was shifting. Not while every mango, every rice cake, every persimmon hinted that Japan was losing, that freedom was inching closer. It was a strange, cruel bargain, to be beaten, starved, humiliated, and then offered fruit as if it were salvation. But Reeves took it. He took every bite, every crumb of sweetness, because it gave him something no guard could take, a reason to endure. And so the camp lived on, half in shadow, half in the strange glow of unexpected mercies. Brutality in the morning, sweetness in the evening. Death in one corner, laughter in another. A place where contradictions twisted the soul but also kept it alive. Reeves lay awake that night, the taste of persimmon still on his tongue. He thought of home, of his mother's apple pies cooling on the windowsill, of the laughter of neighbors on summer evenings, of the rhythm of life before the war. For the first time in months, he dared to believe he might taste those things again, not as memory, but as reality. For the first time, hope did not feel like a blade. It felt like a seed. The first thunder of engines came before sunrise. Reeves sat up in the darkness, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and mildew inside the barracks. At first he thought it was a dream, the steady hum of engines, faint but distinct, rolling like a wave across the dawn. The other men stirred too, some blinking into the gloom, others clutching their thin blankets as if to reassure themselves they weren't imagining it. Then the earth trembled. A low rumble passed beneath their mats, shaking dust loose from the rafters. Outside, a guard shouted in Japanese, boots striking the dirt, and then the sky cracked open. Bombs, distant at first, faint flashes on the horizon, but real. The Americans had returned. The prisoners rushed to the slats of the barrack walls, peering through gaps, straining for a glimpse. In the distance, above the dark silhouettes of palms, Reeves saw the flicker of fire against the clouds. It was far, perhaps 20, 30 miles, but close enough to rattle the bones of the men inside the camp. Larkin whispered, "That's not a drill, that's ours." His voice trembled, not with fear but with wonder. For weeks after, the rhythm of the camp changed. By day, the men worked and suffered as before, dragging logs, clearing brush, laboring until their thin frames bent like reeds. But at night, the skies belonged to the Americans. The sound of engines became familiar, a low chorus that filled their hearts with anticipation. Sometimes the ground shook, sometimes the guards shouted and pointed toward the horizon, but always the prisoners knew the war was moving closer. and with it came a strange twist in their existence. The food became better. Not always, not consistently, but unmistakably different. Bowls of rice accompanied by pickled vegetables, portions of fish, once even a tin of condensed milk passed from hand to trembling hand. For men who had grown accustomed to starvation, it was as if the war outside had changed the very rules within the wire. Reeves began to notice how the guards carried themselves differently. Some strutted more aggressively, swinging their rifles and barking orders as though determined to smother any trace of hope. But others seemed distracted, glancing nervously at the sky whenever an engine roared, or lingering outside the wire with faces Reeves could only describe as resigned. One evening, after a brutal day hauling timber, Reeves and his group were ordered to sit by the edge of the yard. A guard approached with something in his arms, a tray. On it lay small cakes, pale and round, dusted with what looked like sugar. The prisoners stared in disbelief. The guard set the tray down and gestured impatiently. "Eat." Reeves picked one up, his fingers trembling. The cake was soft, its surface powdered. He bit into it, and for a heartbeat he tasted home sweetness, unmistakable and real, filling his mouth and bringing tears to his eyes. It wasn't pie, it wasn't chocolate, but it was sugar, and in that moment it was everything. The others devoured theirs with similar reverence. Men closed their eyes, savoring every chew. Some laughed softly, others wept. Larkin leaned back against the dirt wall, licking sugar from his fingers as though it were gold. But Reeves didn't just taste sweetness. He tasted a question. Why? Why now, when the war was clearly turning? Why spend sugar and flour on prisoners when Japan itself was said to be starving? He remembered whispers that Tokyo had been bombed, that supply ships were being sunk, that rations across the islands had shrunk. And yet here, in this camp, American prisoners were eating sweets. That night he turned it over and over in his mind. It wasn't kindness. He knew that much. Kindness was rare in Cabanatuan, fleeting as a shadow. No, this was something else, something calculated. The answer came days later, in the form of silence. One morning the guards assembled the prisoners in the yard. Their faces were hard, eyes colder than usual. An officer spoke sharply in Japanese, his words interpreted by a Filipino forced into service. The camp was to remain alert. No one was to attempt escape. Any attempt would mean immediate execution. The officer's gaze swept across the haggard Americans, his jaw tight. Reeves felt his stomach sink. The sweets, the fruit, they had been preparation. Not mercy, not kindness, preparation. The guards needed the prisoners alive, not collapsing, not dying too quickly. Alive enough to march if necessary. Alive enough to be moved, perhaps as shields, perhaps as bargaining chips. The realization burned through the barracks like fire. Men who had once laughed over mangoes and persimmons now whispered in dread. The very food that had felt like salvation suddenly seemed poisoned with purpose. And yet, even knowing this, they ate, because they had to, because to refuse meant weakness, collapse, death. The sweetness still gave strength, even if it came wrapped in cruelty. The bombings grew closer. One night the sky above erupted in fire. The prisoners huddled in their barracks, the earth shaking beneath them as bombs fell only miles away. The guards shouted, running, some firing rifles at the sky in futility. Reeves crouched against the wall, covering his head, and thought of home. Not of the war, not of the fighting, but of quiet evenings in Ohio, the smell of rain on dirt roads, the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen. When the raid ended, smoke curled in the distance. The prisoners rose, dazed but alive. The next morning they were given slices of pineapple. The fruit was overripe, sticky, its juices staining their fingers. Reeves bit into his and felt the absurdity wash over him. Bombs one night, pineapple the next. Death and sweetness, twinned together. The contradictions of the camp had never been sharper. Life and death, cruelty and mercy, despair and hope, all colliding in the space of days. Reeves realized something else too. The guards were no longer gods. They were men. Flawed, frightened, desperate men caught between duty and survival, offering fruit and sugar not from strength but from weakness. And in that realization, Reeves felt his resolve harden again. If they were breaking, he could endure. If they were feeding him to keep him alive, then he would live. Because he knew now the end was coming. The heat had grown unbearable. By late summer, the sun over Luzon felt like a hammer, beating down on every roof and every back bent beneath its rays. Reeves felt it most during roll call, when the prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder in the dust, their ribs showing through uniforms long reduced to rags. Sweat ran down their temples, flies hovered around their faces, and the guards barked orders with a sharpness that betrayed unease. The war was pressing in, everyone could feel it. The first undeniable sign came when the guards themselves began receiving less. Where once they strode through camp with pressed uniforms and tidy rations, now their sleeves were rolled, their belts pulled tighter. They ate hurriedly, furtively, as though ashamed. Reeves watched one young soldier gnaw at a sweet potato like a starving child, and in that moment he knew Japan was cracking. And then came the sweetest contradiction of all. That evening, after a long day of hauling bamboo, the prisoners were summoned to the yard. The officer stood before them, stern-faced, flanked by 2 guards holding baskets. From the baskets they drew out fruit, bananas, pineapples, mangoes, more than the men had seen in months. Gasps spread through the ranks. The guards set them down in front of the prisoners with a sharp gesture. Eat. The men fell upon the fruit like wolves. Reeves bit into a banana, soft and rich, its flavor exploding across his tongue. Around him, men laughed and wept, juice running down their chins. For a moment, it was as if the wire, the rifles, the fear, none of it existed. Only the sweetness remained. But Reeves could not shake the thought. Why now, when supplies were failing? Why offer prisoners such bounty when Japan itself was starving? The answer came days later in whispers from new arrivals. American forces had landed further north. The Japanese lines were buckling. Liberation was no longer a dream. It was a matter of time. The guards, Reeves realized, were feeding them not from generosity but from calculation. They wanted the prisoners alive, presentable, not emaciated skeletons when the reckoning came. Hope spread like wildfire, dangerous and uncontrollable. Men who had been silent for months now spoke freely of home, of family, of the meals they would eat once they returned. Reeves listened, half believing, half fearing the cruelty of disappointment. Yet even he could not deny what the skies told him. For now the bombers came daily. The roar of engines filled the air, the horizon lit with fire. Each raid brought smoke curling into the sky, closer, always closer. The guards grew jumpy, shouting less with conviction and more with fear. Reeves caught one staring at the heavens, his lips moving in prayer. And then came the night that sealed it. The camp awoke to chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance, dogs barked, and the horizon glowed red with fire. American planes had struck nearby, and the guards ran through the yard, shouting, rifles in hand, eyes wide with panic. Reeves crouched with the others in the barracks, his heart pounding. He thought this might be the end, a massacre, a desperate slaughter before liberation could arrive. But the order never came. Instead, the guards disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a handful behind. By morning, the camp was a husk of itself. The Japanese presence had thinned, their control unraveling. That day, for breakfast, the prisoners were given something extraordinary. Sweet rice balls, sticky with sugar, packed tight as though meant to sustain them for days. Reeves ate his portion slowly, tasting each grain, and he understood. The Japanese weren't feeding them anymore to break them. They were feeding them because the end had come. 2 days later, the distant rumble of artillery reached their ears. By nightfall, gunfire echoed through the hills. The guards vanished one by one. And then, in the pale light of dawn, the wire was cut. American soldiers stormed into the camp, their uniforms sharp, their rifles ready, their faces fierce with purpose. The prisoners rose, dazed, tears streaming, too weak to run but strong enough to cheer. Reeves stumbled forward, the taste of sweet rice still lingering on his tongue, and for the first time in years he felt the weight lift. Freedom! Later, when he would look back on those days, Reeves would remember the contradictions most. The beatings, the starvation, the cruelty, but also the fruit, the desserts, the moments of sweetness that had seemed impossible. They were not mercy, not truly. They were survival, the strange, twisted logic of a collapsing empire trying to keep its prisoners alive long enough for the war to end. But to Reeves and the others, they had meant something more. Each mango, each rice cake, each persimmon had been a promise, even if the Japanese had never intended it. A promise that life was still possible, that the world beyond the wire still existed, waiting. And when liberation finally came, it was not just freedom that the men tasted. It was sweetness, pure and undeniable, the taste of survival carried through fruit and sugar into the future. Reeves never forgot it. He never forgot the cruel paradox of it all. But he also never ate a slice of pineapple or a spoonful of sugar again without remembering the moment it had given him the strength to endure. The war had been built on steel, fire, and blood. But in the quiet corners of captivity, survival had sometimes come in something smaller, stranger, and unforgettable. A piece of fruit, a mouthful of sweetness, proof that even in the darkest places, life could endure.